that the center has been offering at least one online program every month since we held our first virtual conference back in April. The topic of this one tonight is of great personal interest to me. I lived in Japan for about a year and a half, and it's also a good example of how anyone can use the photographs in our collections. And we welcome this kind of use and are happy to supply images for any similar project. So if there's a place that you've been and want to use historic images from our collections, we are happy to make that happen. Just let us know. The photographs in the presentation tonight come from the collection of Victor Hand. And I believe Victor might be tuning in tonight. We'll try to bring him in for the Q&A session at the end, as I'm sure he'll be able to answer some of the questions much better than I could. I'd also like to welcome members of the Black Hawk chapter of the National Railway Historical Society. We're so glad that you can enjoy our programming while your regular meetings are on hold, and we're certainly glad to have you here with us tonight. And finally, I would like to extend a special welcome to anyone joining us from Japan. For any rail enthusiasts joining us from Japan, please let me know if I make any mistakes in any of my narration. I'd sure appreciate any feedback of that sort or anything else. We're really glad you're here, and we hope you enjoy the photographs in the show tonight. Dozo yoroshiku onegai shimasu. So, with that, the title of the presentation references a famous work of Japanese literature, translated in some ways as The Narrow Road to the Deep North, which is a masterpiece of prose and verse by Matsuo Basho, Japan's greatest poet of the 17th century. Now, Basho lived in Edo, which is of course now Tokyo, and he traveled extensively at a time when travel was both rare and dangerous. The Narrow Road to the Deep North chronicles 6 months of walking through the Tohoku region of northern Japan, northern Honshu, which is Japan's main island. And now tonight we're going even further north to Hokkaido, the northernmost of Japan's 4 main islands. And this is Victor Hand on the left and his friend Harold Edmondson in Hakodate at the southwestern tip of Hokkaido in June of 1966. They spent 11 days in Hokkaido on that trip, and they returned in January of 1971 for another 10 days. The photographs in this show come from those 2 trips. Now, 35 years later, I spent 19 months in Hokkaido with my wife, Maureen Muldoon, teaching English to high school students and writing and photographing trains as much as possible. I was not yet aware of Victor's photography, but I visited many of the same places he did, and I'll be adding some of my own photographs to his tonight. But let me start by setting the scene for Victor's first trip. This is Japan in 1966. Here we have an electric train of the 2-year-old Hokkaido Shinkansen, the world's first high-speed railway, sailing through Hamamatsucho Station in Tokyo. This is also Japan in 1966. 3 steam locomotives are ready for duty at the Taira Roundhouse in Fukushima Prefecture, just 120 miles north of Tokyo in the Tohoku region. So how did these 2 things coexist? The answer is actually pretty simple. Following World War II, Japan saw a decline in freight traffic and a surge in its passenger business. Its railway leaders correctly perceived a long-term trend. They invested heavily in high-speed electric trains between their major cities. With limited resources, they invested far less in diesel power early on, leaving steam locomotives in charge of their non-electrified lines. And that lasted well into the 1960s throughout the entire nation, and as late as 1975 in Hokkaido. Let me introduce the locomotives. Like most railways in Japan, all of these were Cape gauge, which is 3 foot 6 inches, a good bit smaller than American railroads. And this engine here is about as typical as they come in a setting that is quintessentially Japanese. This is a D51 class 282 Makato locomotive pulling a northbound freight train at Mosaicushi in central Hokkaido. In the late steam era, these engines were the workhorses of the Japanese national railways, which had more than 1,100 of them. Typical of the passenger engines was the C57 Pacific. One of these pulled the last regularly scheduled passenger train in Japan, which ran in Hokkaido in December of 1975. They could top 60 miles an hour and develop 28,000 pounds of tractive effort. And that was plenty to roll long passenger trains up and down the coastal plains, but the mountains sometimes demanded a bit more power. The D51s had 41,000 pounds of tractive effort and could still hit 55 miles per hour. They frequently hauled passenger trains on mountainous routes, like this one charging north from Hakodate with a long-distance local train. And now that D51s often pulled passenger trains in the mountains, it might suggest a need for even larger freight engines. and that need was fulfilled by the D-52, a 282 that was 10% heavier than the D-51. 285 of these war babies were built in the mid-1940s. With the decline in freight and the surge in passenger traffic following the war, the National Railways had 49 of these rebuilt into express passenger engines, creating the C-62 class 464s, which used D-52 boilers on new frames. They initially pulled express trains called the Tsubame between Tokyo and Osaka on the Hokkaido main line, where one of them set the world speed record for narrow-gauge steam locomotives at 80 miles an hour in 1954. And 2 years later, the Hokkaido line was electrified, and the C-62s needed new work. A few of them went north to Hokkaido, where they pulled express trains between Hakodate and Sapporo. Much of the route was mountainous, which required double heading. This was one of the last great steam operations in Japan. It was the show that Victor and Harold went to see. And like any good trip, they found that and a whole lot more. Note the insignia on the smoke deflector in the shape of a swallow, Tsubame in Japanese, the name of the train these engines originally pulled. And note too the laser-like focus of the goggle-clad young fireman leaning out of the right-hand window of the cab. Let's look inside another cab. This is a similar C-60 locomotive running into Tohoku. The controls look similar to American cabs, but the driver sits on the left and he wears white gloves. Well, this is Hokkaido's railway network as it appeared in 1966. And this is the Hokkaido rail network 40 years later, when I was there, after many local and secondary lines had been abandoned. Hokkaido faces declining population, deindustrialization, and outmigration from rural communities into the cities. Since I left, even more branch lines have closed, and several of the main routes in the east and the north face uncertain futures. But let's go back to 1966, when busy railways still covered most of the island. At that time, Hokkaido had no rail connection to the rest of Japan. The Seikon undersea tunnel did not open until 1988. Everyone and everything came to the island by boat or by plane, with most arriving by ferry in the port of Hakodate. From there, almost everything went north on the busy Hakodate main line. Railway construction began relatively late in Hokkaido in 1880, with a 20-mile segment between the capital of Sapporo and the port of Otaru on the Sea of Japan. It took more than 20 years to build what became the Hakodate main line, stretching more than 260 miles from its namesake city in the southwest to Asahikawa in the northeast. The first stretch north from Hakodate illustrates the challenges that plagued railway builders throughout Hokkaido. The coast would have offered a water-level route, but it is long and meandering and includes rocky cliffs that rise almost vertically out of the sea. Inland routes are far more direct, but also more mountainous. From Hakodate, the railway climbs 500 feet before descending right back to sea level. During Victor's first visit in 1966, that northbound climb was still a single track with a 2% grade. Traffic was heavy, and Victor found a wonderful place to observe the action at the signal station of Niyama, near the midpoint of the climb. Here we see a D-52 blasting up the 2% grade with a northbound freight train, while a local passenger train waits in the distance at the station. A double heading was common for freight trains. This is a D-52 leading a D-51, and if you look closely, you can see the larger boiler and tender of the first engine. And here's one of those C-62s leading the Teine Express bound for Sapporo. While these were among the most powerful steam locomotives in Japan, they did not tackle this grade alone with such heavy passenger trains. Note the smoke at the rear of this one. Coming from a D-52, shoving hard to help its former classmate maintain track speed at the 2% grade. And Niyama had almost everything the steam photographer could want, including a tunnel, where Victor captured this D-51 blasting into daylight with a freight train north. Climbing above offered this view, where Victor caught a northbound local train heading for Sapporo. There was even a truss bridge over a road, seen here in a color view of a D-52 leading a freight train north. Note the flat car carrying 12-foot shipping containers. Those were new in 1966. They have since become standard for almost rail freight service in Japan. On another day, Victor again called a C-62 leading the Teine Express out of Hakodate. It's a damp, misty afternoon with low clouds hanging over the mountains, the thick air causing an enormous plume of steam. Of the 11 days that Victor and Harold were in Hokkaido in June of 1966, they spent at least part of 3 of them here at Miyama. They had good reason to do so. Later that same year, JNR finished double tracking this section. The new track follows a different alignment with a gentler grade, which reduced the drama at this location. Victor was just ahead of many similar changes throughout Hokkaido. Continuing north, this is the view that greets you on the other side of the summit tunnel. The tracks hug Lake Konuma, and beyond it lies Komagatake, an active volcano rising to a height of more than 3,700 feet. Victor attempted only one train photograph here in 1966, and the composition wasn't quite perfect. He returned in the winter of 1971, catching this D51 leading a local passenger train south. And he wisely used a sheet of color-negative film to record this D52 leading a freight train south along the frozen lake, with Komagatake setting in a blanket of white beneath the blue sky. This is the first place where I practically stood in Victor's footsteps. Although you can see that I'm further up the hill on the higher track, the track in Victor's photographs is barely visible through the trees. This is a Kiha 40 diesel railcar, introduced in 1978 and still a mainstay of local passenger service in 2006. It's not nearly as exciting as a D52, though. But this shot looks the other way, where the morning sun shines briefly in the spring and summer. This is a DD51 diesel hydraulic locomotive leading a container train north. These 2,200 horsepower center cabs were among the first truly successful diesels in Japan. Introduced in 1962, they eventually replaced steam in Hokkaido, and many of them were still running when I lived there. I also caught a steam locomotive here. This is a C11 Tank Engine number 171, one of 2 that still run in Hokkaido. Between the black engine and the brown landscape, I opted for a black and white shot here, something of a preemptive homage to Victor's photographs. Just to the north is Onuma Station, now called Onuma Koen, where Victor caught a D51 departing south with a freight train. Note the water tower in the distance at the far right and the signal bridge over the tracks. The signal bridge was still standing 40 years later when I took my own going-away shot of a southbound container train here. The track layout is largely unchanged, but the water tower is gone. Lucky for us, Victor made a wonderful photograph of it. This view looks back north with Komagatake framed perfectly beneath the waterspout. Victor didn't use many sheets of film on static shots, but when he did, he made them count. I love this composition, right down to the shovel resting against the base of the water tower. Now, lacking a water tower, I used the station's overhead walkway to frame Komagatake at dusk when I was there. From Onuma, the Hakodate main line returns to sea level, following the edge of Ushiura Bay for 38 miles to Oshamambe, a major division point on the railway. This was and is a busy, double-tracked railroad. In this early morning view, Victor captured a meet between 2 trains at Kita Toyotsu Station. Parts of the coast here are quite rugged, like at Otoshibe. And this is a D52 leading a freight train north, with the winter tide lapping at the tracks on what looks like a miserably cold day in January of 1971. Perfect for photographing steam locomotives. Turning around, the view in the other direction is nearly as good, this time with the D51 steaming south with a mixed freight. Working his way around the hillside, Victor recorded one more train here, a southbound local. The stiff wind off the bay has blown the steam back over the train. The sky is cleared enough to reveal a tunnel in the background and the snow-covered mountains that lie to the north. My only attempt at this location was almost completely fogged in, not an uncommon occurrence on the Hokkaido coast. This is the Twilight Express heading south, an overnight sleeping car train that ran every other day between Sapporo and Osaka. Here's a container train coming north with a DF200, Japan's modern freight diesel. This is still a nice spot, and I wish I'd tried here again on a clear day. Victor had a clear day in 1971, when he was 6 miles north at Yamakoshi for the Tene Express rolling south behind a single C62. The next station to the north, less than 3 miles away, is Yakumo, where D51 steams north with the freight train. Looking the other way at Yakumo, Victor caught an express heading south, and I just love the tonality of this image, with details in everything from the dark shadows of the locomotive boiler to the bright highlights up in the clouds. The snow-covered mountains looming around the bay hint at the more dramatic scenery that is to come as we head further north. 4 miles beyond Yakumo is Yamazaki, where the tracks practically run on the beach. The physical plant here is noteworthy. The bridge is concrete, the retaining wall is concrete, and the double-track main line is absolutely bulletproof. Everything about this railroad was modern, except for the locomotives, and of course that was soon to change. But not just yet. Victor made good use of the slanting afternoon sunlight for a mixed freight steaming north in the broad tidal plain, approaching the division point of Oshamambe. The route splits at Oshamambe, which was a major servicing point for the steam locomotives of the era. Victor recorded this portrait of a D51 and a C11 locomotive at the roundhouse in stalls 6 and 7. The latter is a sister to the 171 that I saw. These were 264 tank engines that were common on branch lines throughout Japan. Victor photographed a few of them, but he mainly saw the bigger engines of the main lines. Inside, a few nights later, he found D51s in for servicing, parked with their stacks under the vent hoods in the roundhouse. Outside, on the same night, he used a flash bulb to illuminate number 150, passing the water plug in a snowstorm. The servicing facilities look like an erector set, and the steel coaling tower looms like one of the gigantic robots popular in anime TV shows and manga comic books. On another night, Victor made a color portrait of the 148. What strikes me about this shot is just how dirty these locomotives can appear in color. They're covered in rust and grime that seem to accumulate on locomotives the world over as the steam era neared its end. Better, perhaps, that black and white photography predominated. On a beautiful June morning in 1966, the C-57 class Pacific storms out of town with a passenger train north. You can see the coaling tower just to the right of the smokestack, while the freight train waits in the distance beneath the pedestrian overpass at the station. I stood on that overpass for this photograph in November 2006, looking the other way 40 years later. I believe Victor was standing at the end of this platform for his shot, possibly using a signal for elevation. Now, the train in his photograph was on this track, following this route onto the Muraran main line in the distance at right. And keep in mind that Japanese railways practice left-hand running. The shop facilities in Victor's photographs would have been on this empty field far left. Scarcely a trace of them remains in 2006. My photograph includes 2 moving trains. In the foreground at right, a Super Hokkaido Limited Express is arriving from Sapporo. It's a Type 281 diesel multiple unit with a top speed of 80 miles an hour and tilting technology to take the curves at high speed. In the distance, a white local train is on the Hakodate main line, which makes a left-hand turn and heads into those mountains looming in the distance. Between Oshamambe and Otaru, the Hakodate main line crosses the spine of Hokkaido from the Pacific Ocean to the Sea of Japan. Built mostly in 1902 and 1903, it's a single-track roller coaster railroad of 2.5% mountain grades. By the 1920s, the Muraran main line offered a mostly water-level alternative, also with long stretches of single track. It handled most of the freight traffic, but the passenger expresses still used the Hakodate line, with those C-62s double-heading over the mountain grades. Spectacular in all seasons, in the winter, it was truly sublime. The local trains look pretty good too, and this one is heading north at Futumata, the first station out of Oshamambe. A highway overpass provides the vantage here against a stunning mountain backdrop. Another 20 miles takes us fully into the mountains, where we'll look at 3 photographs taken on June 14th and 15th, 1966, around Kamimena Station. This one shows a northbound local in the morning. Afternoons here featured 2 northbound trains back-to-back. First local number 137 from Oshamambe to Sapporo, and not far behind it came express number 105 behind a pair of C-62s. I'm guessing the express overtook the local at one of the next stations. Victor shot both trains on this sweeping curve on both of these days. This location, or this area at least, was Victor's top priority for his winter trip in 1971. He's back at Kamemena on January 17th for a pair of C-62s on train 104. There were one or two of these expresses each way in daylight, depending on where you were and the length of the days. And of course, the days were short in January. And there were still some steam-powered local trains, like this one heading south, also at Kamemena on January 17th. There was only one freight train each way on the Hakodate main line, at least in daylight, and they mainly handled local traffic. This is the southbound at Kamemena on January 17th, behind a single D51. 3 days later, Victor used another sheet of color-negative film to record express number 104 south approaching Mena. The snow-capped mountains in the distance are part of a range called the Niseiko Volcano Group. Here's another view from near Mena on the next day when the clouds had returned. This is the photograph from the opening slide. Victor pulled way back for this gorgeous broadside shot, the freight train steaming south, and I just love the profile of those little two-axle freight cars. The next station north is Rankushi, where a local passenger train rolls south. Victor also photographed a northbound here with lots of steam, but I prefer this view since you can see more of the village and the snow-covered Horibetsu Mountains in the distance. Beyond them, the land falls away to the Sea of Japan. This is my photograph, showing a steam excursion at Niseiko Station in November of 2006. This wasn't a great place to photograph a steam train, but I desperately wanted this overview shot with Mount Yotei, a 6,227-foot stratovolcano that's known as Hokkaido's Mount Fuji. Niseiko is 10 miles beyond Rankushi, the location of Victor's last shot. Niseiko wasn't much of a town in the 1970s, but today Niseiko has become one of the premier ski resort communities in all of Japan. Remarkably, the steam-era turntable remained, at least in 2006, although sadly it wasn't used for this excursion, and the C11 returned tank first. Just north of Niseiko, the tracks run along the Shiribetsu River with Mount Yotei in the distance. These days, diesel rail cars like these are the only regular traffic, running in single or double as local passenger trains. Victor didn't take any photographs with Mount Yotei, which surprises me, although at most of the spots, like this one, a train coming at you is running downgrade, so this would not be a good place to capture hard-working steam locomotives. While Niseiko's tourism has come to dominate the region's economy, the neighboring town of Kuchan was the more important railroad location, at least when Victor was there. He used an overpass to record this view of train 104 departing. And I can't help but zoom in on the left background. That's a Kiha 10 rail car in the foreground there, introduced in 1953 as Japan's first mass-produced diesel rail car. They built more than 700, and they quickly took over local services on the non-electrified lines. These were direct predecessors of the rail cars that I rode all over Hokkaido in 2006 and 7. And just check out all of the rail infrastructure in the background there, and especially this long shed in the middle distance. I photographed it 35 years later. It's still there, although so much else that was in Victor's shot was then gone. Looking the other way, Mount Yotei looms over a desolate station. The platform at left is no longer used, and the track it served has been removed. In the distance, you can see the overpass where Victor would have stood. Let's get back to his photographs, since mine are kind of depressing. This is 6 miles north at Kozawa, where the southbound freight train is crossing the Horikapu River in the morning sun. On the same day at Kozawa, an express storms south behind a pair of C-62s. Here's the freight train again on the following day, right in Kozawa Station. And I love that water tower in the distance, which of course is not there anymore. In the station itself, we see engine 19640, an old soldier built prior to the alphanumeric classification scheme of 1928. This is actually a 9600 class 280 locomotive, a design that proved popular. When they ran out of 9600 numbers, they added a 1 in front and started a new series. Some 800 of these were built, so it required several extra numbers. There were 2 9600s, 3 9600s, so on and so forth. Many of these ran until the end of steam on secondary and branch lines, and this one is leading the daily train from the Iwanai branch. And here it is on the branch a little earlier on the same day, approaching the junction with the main line. From Kozawa, the Iwanai branch followed the Horikapu River to the northwest to its mouth at Iwanai, a port on the Sea of Japan. The short train suggests that there wasn't much business left in 1971, and this branch closed in 1985. Victor caught the same train the next day back on the main line at Kozawa. You can see the bridge at far right that we saw a few slides earlier. The branch train was even shorter on this day. I'm guessing it originated and terminated back at Kuchan, which would have been the big yard in the area. Now, north from Kozawa, the main line swings to the east and climbs out of the river valley, punching through a summit tunnel and emerging at Ginzan Station, which I photographed in May of 2007. This is a 6-car rapid train that was the longest train over the line when I lived there. You could catch it at twilight on the longest days of the year. The ridge above Ginzano offers a panoramic view to the north, looking down the Uichi River Valley, which the railway follows to the Sea of Japan. You can see the lights of a local train at lower left approaching the station. But since many of the trains weren't very interesting when I lived in Japan, I looked for places like this where I could pull back and let the landscape dominate. This is another view from the same spot, partway down the mountain, where a 1-car local train approaches Ginzan on a November evening. It's still a special place in the winter, although I can only imagine what a pair of C-62s must have looked and sounded like climbing this grade. Victor didn't take any shots in this stretch, but I made a number of visits here. I even managed to catch some snow fighting, like this snowblower with a whimsical face painted on its rear plow, and a more primitive snow removal force back at the Kozawa station. Winter also brought a special train to the line, a 3-car streamliner painted for Sapporo's baseball team, the Nippon Ham Fighters, running here as the Niseiko Ski Express. Back to Victor's photographs. He didn't shoot very much on this part of the Hakodate line, but he did catch a pair of C-62s steaming south with train number 104 at Shikaribetsu, located halfway down the Uichi River Valley, between the summit tunnel and the sea. This was January 21st, 1971. These double-headed express trains stopped running in September of that year. From Uichi, the railway follows the Sea of Japan for more than 20 miles. This is the fishing village of Ranchima, with a 1-car local train passing at twilight on a February evening in 2007. It certainly can't match the drama of double-headed Hudsons, but for mood and emotion, this is one of my favorite shots from the Hakodate main line. And now we're in Otaru, a port city and essentially a suburb of Sapporo, thanks in large part to frequent commuter trains. This pair of C-62s departed Sapporo at 10 a.m. with the Tene Express for Hakodate, seen here right after leaving Otaru Station. Today, electrification begins in Otaru and continues through Sapporo all the way to the far end of the Hakodate main line. 40 years later, I photographed the Niseiko Ski Express in almost exactly the same spot, although from a slightly different perspective. There's only one track now, and modern apartments and condos dominate the skyline. Sapporo is less than 20 miles away. And here's the Superhead Station as it appeared in 1966, with the D-51 heading up a morning local train from Otaru to Iwamizawa. This wider shot, taken down the platform, shows the main station building on the far left and a lengthy pedestrian walkway above the tracks. This is a C-57 class Pacific heading up train number 421, which ran from Hakodate all the way across Hokkaido to Kushiro in the far southeast. It left Hakodate at 11:30 p.m., arrived in Sapporo in the morning, and spent all day getting to Kushiro. And here's what Sapporo Station looks like now. My photograph from Christmas Day 2005 looks back in the opposite direction of Victor's previous 2 shots. That's one of the preserved C11s again, this time departing with a holiday train for Otaru. And here's a regular electric train in February of 2007, running in rapid commuter service for Otaru. As in Victor's visits, the main station building is still on the south side of the tracks, which run almost due east-west here, but the station is much larger now, and it's a great example of how Japanese railways sell the air rights above their big city stations to developers. The station is full of shopping centers, restaurants, apartments, office buildings, you name it. Back at ground level in 1966, Victor took several night shots of trains waiting in the station. This is a local preparing to depart for Otaru behind a C-57. And here's another C-57 waiting with the Rishiri, an overnight train to Wakanai on the northernmost tip of Hokkaido up the Soya main line. And here's a C-62 with another overnight train, the Sekihoku, bound for Abashiri in far northeastern Hokkaido. 2 mountain passes with 2.5% grades on the Sekihoku main line demanded a big engine for this train. Night trains still left from Sapporo in all directions when I lived in Hokkaido. There were several bound for the main island of Honshu, pulled by the DD-51 locomotives. And there were diesel multiple unit night trains going to Wakanai, Abashiri, and Kushiro. This is the conductor of the Marimo, preparing to depart for Kushiro. For a higher perspective, there's an observation deck at the top of the station's high-rise tower, offering panoramas of the city from the 38th floor. This view looks back west, down the Hakodate main line towards Otaru and Oshimambe. Let's double back to Oshimambe and look at the other main route. There are 2 main pieces of the Muroran main line. The first was built in 1892 between Iwamizawa and Muroran. Its purpose was to connect the coal mines near Iwamizawa with Muroran's natural harbor. It follows the tidal plain and a broad interior valley, meaning straight track, gentle curves, and low grades. The second piece, however, was built in the 1920s to connect to the Hakodate main line. While the tracks still follow the bay, this part of the coast is extremely rugged. That required extensive tunneling and retaining walls, and there were still long stretches of single track during Victor's visits. This route was at capacity with heavy freight traffic then, which is why the express passenger trains still ran over the mountain passes of the Hakodate main line. Double tracking projects were already underway on the Muroran line during Victor's visits, with the majority finished in 1975. In some cases, that included new tunnels that completely bypassed some of the most spectacular coastal stretches of the original line. Today, all of the long-distance trains, freight as well as express passenger, use the Muroran main line east of Oshimambe. This is Victor's view of a freight train south arriving at Oshimambe off of the Muroran line. Those snow-covered mountains in the background extend all the way down to the edge of Ushiura Bay, where they forced the main line into a long tunnel, which had exited into this interior valley. This is a northbound freight running geographically south here at Railfan, curving to rejoin the coast just ahead. Note the small bridges in the background just beyond the end of the train. They appear in my shot from October 2006. Tree growth has obscured the view of the sweeping curve in Victor's photograph, but a clear cut on the next hill to the south offered views of the tracks on either side of the curve. Here's the wider view. The mountains in the background are the same ones in Victor's shot. The train here is one of my favorites. This is the Hokkaido, an overnight sleeping car train that ran between Tokyo's Ueno Station and Sapporo, pulled by pairs of the specially painted DD-51s through the not-electrified territory of Hokkaido. This is Victor's ground-level view, looking the other way on that sweeping curve at Railfan, where a D-52 charges south. In the distance at right, you can just barely make out the bay above the village of Railfan, where the tracks curve around the base of the hillside and enter a spectacular stretch of coastal running. This is a mixed freight steaming south at water's edge. If you built a model railroad of this, people would say that such a sheer retaining wall wasn't realistic. And here's the same train in a color view, looking the other way. This is a timetabled freight carrying fresh fish in the white reefer cars. My wife and I lived in Muroran, this railway's namesake city, and as soon as I got a decent map of the area and saw the tracks so close to the coast, I fantasized about taking shots like this. But when I went to Railfan, this is what I found: a new road hugging the coast and an abandoned railway tunnel. The double tracking in the 1970s moved the main line further inland into a series of straight tunnels. The narrow road at far left follows the original railway alignment, bypassing the tunnels as we saw in my last shot. The main road, however, is also arrow straight, just like the railroad. I stayed at the campground here, and it was a wonderful experience to listen to the surf lapping gently at the beach as trains roared by on the main line. This is one of those Hokkaido overnight trains again, heading for Sapporo through the misty morning sun. Even better in my mind was the view looking the other way, with the tracks curving along the beach. During my camping trip in August of 2006, some pre-dawn fog created this ethereal atmosphere for a container train rolling south just before sunrise. Back on the coast in 1971, Victor caught a local passenger train steaming north along the retaining wall. This is the last shot we have from that clear day of January 18th. 4 days later, in light snow, he caught a D-52 rolling north a little further up the coast. And here's one more view from this incredible stretch of railroad, with another mixed freight steaming south through the winter snow. Victor didn't take any photographs at the next station, Toyora, but it was one of my favorite spots. It was a great place to show trains along the rugged coast with the tunnel portal in the background. This is another Hokkaido night train bound for Sapporo on a winter morning in 2006. And this is a container train north at the same spot on an October afternoon in peak fall color. In the 21st century, the Mudaran main line hosts more than 50 container trains daily. And just up from Toyora, there's another stretch where longer tunnels bypass the original line on the coast. Note the observation tower on the cliff at upper right. It provided this view of a Super Hokkaido Limited Express moving away from me on the southbound track. The northbound track is inside the mountain in a longer tunnel to the right. To the left of the train are the twin tunnel portals of the original Mudaran main line. The hill I was standing on for that last shot, minus the observation deck, is visible in the background of this photograph by Victor, with a freight train coming north into the town of Abuta. Victor's standing on Highway 37 overpass for this view. And 35 years later, I stood on the very same overpass at twilight on a summer evening. There are still houses between the tracks and the bay, but they're much more modern, and the station here is now called Toya, after a nearby lake that's a popular tourist destination. A few miles further is one of my favorite spots, Nagawa, where the tracks run through coastal fields. On a clear day, you can see Kamagatake all the way across the bay. This is a Super Hokkaido Limited Express just moments before sunset on a June evening in 2007. A few miles further still is my Japanese home of Mudaran, which sits on an oxbow peninsula at the end of a 4-mile branch line. Victor never made it here, and I could go on all night if I got started about Mudaran, a steel mill, port city, straight out of the American Rust Belt. But that's a story for another time. At lower left, though, I would like to point out the modern station that now marks the end of the branch. Maureen and I lived in an apartment just half a mile from here, a 5-minute walk from my vantage point for this shot. From here, the route is now electrified all the way into Sapporo. Now, the Mudaran main line doesn't actually reach Sapporo, but most trains go that way via the Chitose line. The Mudaran line continues due north to Iwamizawa, there, where it rejoins the Hakodate main line. This allowed freight traffic to bypass Sapporo, making Iwamizawa the perfect place for a major classification yard. You can see a hint of those facilities in Victor's photograph from 1966, in the distance beyond this freight train steaming north. Let's zoom in for a closer look. You can see the water tower, the 2-track shop building, quite a few other buildings, just a fraction of Iwamizawa's facilities, which stretch literally for miles. Locomotives abounded, and Victor made this handsome portrait of a D-50 on the same day, June 8, 1966. He also made a series of night photographs on the following evening, including this head-on view with the brick engine house lurking in the background. Here it is with the C57 locomotive. When Japan privatized its railways in 1987, it completely abolished loose car freight business in a paradigm shift to container trains and a few unit trains. Iwamizawa's classification yard and others throughout Japan closed almost overnight. Back at the station, Victor recorded another C57 taking water. This is the Marimo, the night train to Kushiro. We're heading that way for our last segment. 30 miles down the Hakodate main line is Tachikawa, where Victor found another steam terminal. By now, the facility should look familiar. There's a water plug next to the tracks, and a steel gantry-style cooling tower this one of a single-track design. In the distance is the engine house, seen here with the 9600 280. Now, the reason for another major engine terminal so close to the last one is that Takikawa was another important junction. In 1966, the main route to the southeast branched off in Takikawa, running through the mountains of Hokkaido's backbone, bound for the cities of Obihiro, Kushiro, and Nemuro. From Takikawa, the Nemuro main line follows the Surachi River for nearly 70 miles. This is a freight train heading east near Takisato Station. The tracks cross the river at Takisato, just below a small dam, where Victor caught a freight train west on the same day. Now, when I visited Takisato 40 years later, the dam had been replaced by a much larger one. An interpretive sign shows the new dam's location right on top of the bridge in Victor's photograph. The tracks were rerouted through a new tunnel, nearly 5 miles long, bypassing a bend in the river that is now Takisato Lake. The tunnel does offer a nice vantage, which I used for this view of a container train heading east in the fall of 2006. Now, after following the Surachi River to its headwaters, the Nemuro main line goes through a summit tunnel at Karakachi Pass, and then makes a looping descent to the coastal plain. Mountain passes in Japan take their names from the regions they connect. The Kari in Karakachi comes from the Ishikari River Valley of north-central Hokkaido. Okachi comes from the Tokachi region in the southeast, a broad plain with abundant agriculture. And the characters for pass is toge, and it's one of my favorites. It's a compound character of 3 simpler ones that mean mountain, up, and down. It's a great description. While the eastward grade up the pass is long and gradual, the westward grade on the other side was short and steep, with 2.5% gradient, and most of the freight moved west, up that grade. So at Shintoku, at the base of the pass, there was a helper station, and all westbound freight trains received a pusher locomotive here. Loads moving west included coal, seen in the foreground, and lots of forest products. There was also grain, produce, beef, dairy products, and seafood coming out of the abundant hinterland of southeastern Hokkaido. The Victor found more D-51s awaiting their next helper assignments inside the roundhouse. He made both this and the last photograph on June 9, 1966. Shintoku marked the eastern extent of his and Harold's travels in Japan. They came to see those westbound trains attacking the grade, and see them they did. Note the steam plume from the helper locomotive at far right in this view. Here's another westbound with a pusher. This looks to be a solid train of perishable traffic, consisting of containers and reefers. Victor made most of his views on the pass through the signal station of Ninai, a passing siding located halfway up the grade. The signature morning shot was this one, where a high fill on a horseshoe curve offered a view of entire trains against the Hidaka Mountains. This range is the southern spine of Hokkaido, with many peaks above 6,000 feet. The train here consists almost entirely of pulpwood heading west. As does this one, where Victor recorded D-51s both coming and going on this train. There's the coming view and the going away shot. And I love the rider on the tender in his straw hat. I have no idea whether this was a railway worker or just someone hitching a ride, and the latter would not surprise me, given the remoteness of Karakachi Pass in 1966. This was the signature afternoon shot on the pass, the sweeping S-curve against dramatic mountains to the north. Victor had time to record 2 views of this train. And here's the closer shot. When I started going through Victor's photographs from Karakachi Pass, I found so many that I assumed he spent several days here. Once I pulled their captions, however, I was surprised to find that he took all of these shots on the same day, June 11th, 1966. He told me he tried 2 days, both of the previous days, but the weather was too foggy. He and Harold finally got a clear day on this one, and they made great use of it. They saw 2 freight trains east, dropping downgrade, including this one from the same vantage point as the last shot. You can see the Tokachi plain rolling out in the background at right. I'm struck by the immediacy with which the mountains begin here. To me, it's not unlike a smaller and greener version of the Front Range of the Rockies west of Denver, Colorado. Victor shot one passenger train each way on June 11th. This is the westbound, climbing the grade in the afternoon sun. It ran all the way from Kushiro to Hakodate via Sapporo, taking the better part of a day and a night. I would have expected more passenger trains in a day, but the others may have been diesel-powered. There was no shortage of westward freight traffic, though. Victor's notes indicate no fewer than 8 freight trains west on June 11th, just during the daylight hours. He and Harold spent the whole afternoon at this curve, taking in the show as one train after another stormed up the grade. They were just in time. These rails fell silent just a few months later, with the completion of an all-new alignment for the eastern slope of Karakachi Pass. This topographical map from 1954, archived at the University of Texas, shows the original route. From Shintoku, the tracks head north before swinging west to loop up through the mountains to a short tunnel at the summit. And here's the new route. From Shintoku, the tracks turn west before swinging south to a single horseshoe curve and then climbing to enter a much longer and lower summit tunnel. This new alignment lowered the ruling grade from 2.5% down to 1.2% with much wider curves. Where steam locomotives once slogged at 20 miles an hour, high horsepower diesels and diesel multiple units now howl at 50. The old route is now a trail, and just north of Shintoku, it offers a view of trains on the new grade. The new line is still an impressive railroad. This view looks southeast from near the new summit tunnel. That's a westbound container train climbing the grade behind the DF-200. In the distance, you can see the broad horseshoe curve. The western part is in a tunnel at far right. The eastern part crosses a concrete viaduct, protected by metal wind fencing on both sides. This is a wider view from the same spot, showing a Super Azura limited express train. Passenger traffic is heavy today. 6 pairs of these run daily between Sapporo and Kushiro. 6 more pairs run between Sapporo and Obihiro. There's still a fair bit of freight traffic, too, with 7 pairs of container trains, as well as 1 or 2 pairs of unit tank trains. Most of them run at night to avoid the passenger traffic. None of these trains use the original Nimuro main line west of Karakachi Pass. They instead run on the new Seksho line, a more direct route that opened in 1981. Back in Shintoku, the roundhouse that once maintained D51 helpers is long gone, but the station can still offer dramatic views, especially on winter nights in the swirling snow. When I was in Hokkaido, the Marimo sleeper trains met at Shintoku every night at 2:30 in the morning. But it's now been close to 15 years since I lived in Japan, and Hokkaido railroading has changed greatly since then. Maureen and I moved back to the US in 2007. By the end of the decade, all 3 of the overnight trains running north and east of Sapporo had been discontinued. The sleeper trains to and from Honshu were still going strong, but time and progress caught up with them too. Bullet train service to Hakodate began in 2016 with the opening of the Hokkaido Shinkansen. The sleeper trains, in need of new equipment, stopped running, and most of the DD51 locomotives have been retired. More branch lines have been abandoned, and many more routes face uncertain futures. But let's go back to Karakachi Pass in 1966 for one last set of pictures, when the labored exhaust of D51 still echoed up through the Hidaka Mountains. This is the last train that Victor photographed on June 11th, as the evening shadows grew long on the big fill at Inai. Sending a thick pall of coal smoke into the mountain air, D51 number 1072 charged up the grade with a long mixed rate, the driver peering out from the cab with total focus on the task at hand. Turning around, Victor reloaded his 4x5 speed graphic in time for this going away shot in glorious evening light. This train disappearing into the mountain shadows is a fitting last look at the age of steam on Japan's northern island. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I'd be happy to take any questions.
It's a wonderful blend of your photography and Victor's photography to craft your narrative.
It was really great fun to go through Victor's stuff. I mean, it's just one of the many benefits of our collections and the great work our collection staff do in archiving them, and Victor's confidence in us to place his work with us and help to make sure we get all the metadata right. and what a treat to see the place I lived, 35 or 40 years before I was there, but to
Yeah.
recognize it and see how different it is, but still see the similarities too.
Yeah, I have a question. Were you familiar with Victor's work while you were there? Have you known that he had been there? Were you aware of him much as a photographer at that time?
I was certainly aware of him as a photographer, and I knew him, for his worldwide steam photography as well as his domestic photography of all railroads in the U.S. But I don't think I was aware specifically of his Hokkaido photography at the time. I think I would have met him at the conference prior to going into Japan, but I don't think we talked about Hokkaido until after I got back, and so it was great fun for me to know that he'd been to some of the same places and to trade those stories. And so as soon as our archives team got through that part of his archive, I started digging through those, and finally had a chance over the winter break this year to really look through all of them systematically.
Yeah,
So that was just a wonderful discovery.
yeah, I bet that was great to go back and revisit some of those places and memories.
Well, especially to find the places that we almost stood in the same spot, like Kamagatake in the background and the overpass at Obuta, just to see the similar views and to see how things lined up, to recognize familiar landmarks was always a lot of fun. Or just some building in the background that was still there. That was always exciting to see.
Mm-hmm. A few questions coming in.
Oh, good. Well, while those come in, I will just remind everyone that this will be posted onto our YouTube page in the not too distant future, as soon as Haley's able to do that, probably by the early next week, and that is youtube.com/railphotoart. And of course, you can also get there off of our website, which is, let me get that in the camera, railphoto-art.org.
First question from someone we're very familiar with, Bon.
Oh, hi, Bon.
Yeah. Bon was curious. How is it that nearly all of the steam engines are missing pilots? He also noticed that some of the steam engines have two headlights, one in front of each smoke detector.
That is a really good question, and it might actually be answered in a book that I received in the mail today, which is a great segue into one of my favorite Japanese photographers, Naotaka Hirota, who I would consider the Richard Steinheimer of Japan, or some people would even say that Steinheimer is the Hirota of the U.S. But he does phenomenal photography. This is an English language book called Steam Locomotives of Japan. You can find it was published in the 1970s. You can find used copies of it today for $20 or $25. So hopefully Bond will find some technical details in here, and I will pass those along as soon as I do. But while I'm talking about Naotaka Hirota, I have to show you one of my absolutely, if I can get the glare off of it, all-time favorite railroad photography books, The Lure of Japan's Railways. This was published in the early 1970s. It's got about 100 photographs, mostly black and white. The photography is as fresh, as an inventive and creative today as it was when it was published. If you're interested in creative railroad photography at all, you owe it to yourself to get this book. You can find it on eBay for usually $25 or $30, and that is a bargain, I believe. And so, Bob, I'll have to tell you more when I've had a chance to dig through my new acquisition here.
Yeah, Dennis Lovely says he has Lure on the way as well.
Good. You will not be disappointed, Dennis.
Okay, we have a question from... I'm sorry, every time someone puts in a new question, it scrolls all the way down.
Sure.
So a question from Richard Gray, who says he knew Victor's daughter and who has traveled several times in Japan and always on train. And he is wondering if you have ever traveled in Shikaku, especially on the Dosan Limited Express.
I got to the northern part of Honshu and as far south as Kyoto and Kobe and Osaka, but I was never able to get to Kyushu or Shikoku, other than I actually sailed from China to Japan when I first got there, and so I sailed through the inland sea that runs between, I believe that's Shikoku and Honshu, and so I sailed past those islands, but I never actually got down to them to ride their trains. I really focused on Hokkaido while I was there. They had about 1,500 miles of active track at the time, and I wanted to make sure I got in all of those in my time in Japan. And I was able to do that and had a couple of wonderful trips to Kyoto and to Tokyo, but wasn't able to do more than that. So possibly a future trip to Japan might be in order someday.
Hmm. Yeah, and here Jacob Adams asked if you got to any other parts of Japan. I'm assuming he means off of Hokkaido, and if there are any railway museums there.
Yeah, so the big railway museum in Hokkaido, I believe, is in or in Japan is in Kyoto, and it was specifically the steam locomotive museum when I was there. I think it has since been upgraded to kind of the full transportation museum, still with a railway focus. But and I don't have the name of it handy, but I can certainly look that up. But yeah, Kyoto would have, I believe, the largest railway museum in Japan. There's a small one in Otaru, or at least there was. I think it would still be a going concern just outside of Sapporo. Um, and then, of course, there's a number of preserved locomotives under canopies or out in the cities, some places, and the two steam locomotives I mentioned that still run. I'm not sure what their schedules are these days, but I'm pretty sure that there's a winter operation that still runs in out of Kushiro on the Sinmo main line in the far eastern part of Hokkaido. And I photographed that a couple of times. Victor didn't get over there, so I didn't put anything of my photography in where Victor didn't get to. But that's a really nice operation. The engines run by themselves without diesel helpers. It's a really beautiful kind of marshy wetland area that gets lots of snow, but also a lot of sun in the wintertime. So you have a chance to get out to Kushiro in the winter. I think it runs every day, at least it did at the time. I'm not sure if that's changed due to the coronavirus right now, but I believe that would typically run from like early January through mid-March, maybe, with daily service. And that's a beautiful line and a great place to see Japanese steam in action in Hokkaido.
A few questions about Victor. Victor Hand is his last name, in case we haven't mentioned that in a while. Um,
Oh, yes.
about the type of film and camera Victor used. Did he exclusively use a 4x5 speed graphic? And then what type of color and black and white film did he use?
Yeah, so I know Victor used the 4x5 speed graphic almost exclusively. He did some medium format work as well, but everything from Japan was on his 4x5 speed graphics. Um, and if he's here, maybe he can let us know. I'm not sure of the film
I
types.
don't believe he is. I
Oh,
can
shoot.
check.
Well, um, I know he used color negative film for all of the color views. I'm not sure what the emulsion was, but that's easily discerned. And I believe I think he would have used. Oh boy, I'm gonna screw up my Kodak film names. I think he used T-Max, which would have been, I think, the higher speed black and white film. But someone can correct me if I'm wrong about that. But I think he typically shot with the 400 speed black and white film to get a little bit more depth of field and higher shutter speeds. But we'll have to check that in the metadata. I should have known these photographers would have more technical questions for me.
Yeah. Let's see. Martin O'Toole.
Yeah,
Um,
400 speed Tri-X. He's
okay.
right. Yes. Yeah. Sorry. T-Max is the slower film. I'm such a product of the digital era.
Okay. And Martin O'Toole recalls that Trains did a Black Raven article sometime in the past, and is curious if you used that when you were looking for spots or kind of framing your photography.
No, I really didn't track down any of Trains Magazine's coverage of Japan until after I got back. Um, that was a great part of the adventure. I mean, it was frustrating trying to find where to go and where the good shots were and these kinds of just any information really. I picked up a little bit of Japanese kind of conversationally just to be able to get around, but I'm by no means a student of the language, and I really, kind of embarrassingly didn't learn very much. And that was a great challenge to finding places. But it was part of the quest too, and there was really very limited information on the internet in English at least, and so I had to do some digging in foreign websites and try to navigate some of the Japanese websites um, and thankfully the maps and just being able to ride trains and see where good spots were really opened up a lot of opportunities. I didn't have a car there, and so we traveled extensively by train and on foot. Luckily, the local trains were frequent, and they stopped at small stations every few miles, so you could really get almost anywhere by local train and hike to good spots for photography, which was a lot of fun. I actually enjoy that more than chasing by cars.
Yeah, well, it sounds a lot more convenient too. Steve Lang asks, were you ever at risk for any railroad trespassing violations while you were in Japan? Anything like what we see here in the US?
It really was not very much of an issue there. The stations are all public, and in fact, even the big city stations where you had to go through gates, you could buy a platform ticket. So that was a ticket not to go anywhere; it was simply a ticket to be on the platform. And there is um, really a strong railfan culture in Japan. Lots of photography. So the idea of someone going out to take photographs is really not considered a security concern around Japanese railways. It's really a big part of the culture. So obviously I tried not to trespass as I do here. And especially on the electrified lines, you really don't want to be close to the tracks. There's too many risks there. So, and there were always good places to get photographs away from the tracks. And I kind of like some of the scenic views where you pull back and take in more of the landscape. So no, trespassing really wasn't an issue there at all. It wasn't something you needed to do to get great photographs. So that was not really a problem.
It sounds like if there was any place in the world, Hokkaido was the place to include landscape in a lot of your shots.
Oh, it's a beautiful place, but so much of Japan really is. I mean, the coastal running in so many places. There's just some really beautiful mountain coastlines there. It's just a spectacularly beautiful country.
Mhm. We've had a few questions kind of addressing this topic of just what was it like rail fanning in Japan? What was the culture like? What was the hospitality like? Did you meet any other rail fans, any photographers while you were out?
So, I mean, just overall, the Japanese were incredibly welcoming and accommodating, and would really go out of their way to help you if you needed help, and so very appreciative of any effort you made to learn or speak even the tiniest bit of Japanese, which really served me well in rural communities. Even learning a little bit went a long way in some of those places. So anytime I needed help or got into trouble, I mean, I got people would stop and offer me rides. I wasn't even sticking my thumb out, but I had a couple of people give me rides into town when I'd been out in the mountains and the rainstorm had come in or something. So I mean, people were just really wonderful and very curious, and a lot of it was really a lot of fun. I mean, riding the local trains, I really love doing that. And sometimes you'd be on a local train, there'd be a group of high school students sitting a couple of rows away, and you could hear them sort of practicing their English in hushed tones. And before they got to their station, the bravest one in the group would come up and introduce themselves and try to have a conversation, which I just always really loved, and really tried to meet them anytime they did that. So no, it was really a fantastic experience. And yeah, I feel really fortunate to have been there, and just so very appreciative to all the Japanese people who helped me, and to several English teacher friends who were really helpful, including my friend Dustin Kidd, who I don't know if he's on here tonight or not, but he was a bit of a rail fan as well, and speaks phenomenal Japanese, and really helped me figure out a lot of the places to go, and even provided transportation for some of them. And other friends who joined me for various adventures, and some Japanese families that really took Marina and I under their wings. Fuki and Hiromi Goto and Tamakamai, foremost among them, who were well-traveled and fluent in English, and not rail fans themselves, but once I started buying Japanese train books and bringing them over, they took interest in them and translated the captions for me. And I think I actually enjoyed seeing photographs of places that they remembered from their childhood. And I was really struck by the notion that here in the US, we have such a car culture, and people have fond memories of family road trips in the station wagon. But in Japan, it's a train culture, and people have fond memories of taking the train with their family. And so the train is just such a greater part of everyday life in contemporary and historic Japanese culture. And so that was really fun to get to experience. Um, and I know I've rambled on a bit with this one question, but to answer whether I met any Japanese rail fans, I did. Not as many as I would have liked. I probably would have learned more Japanese had I met more Japanese rail fans.
Yeah.
But on a winter trip to the Sekihoku main line in northeastern Hokkaido, I met a group of about 10 or 12 Japanese rail fans from the Tokyo and Osaka areas in Honshu, who would come up for a weekend trip. And they totally took me under their wing. They taught me all of the names of the Japanese words for trains that I hadn't come across in my phrase books, and showed me the good spots and took me to dinner with them, and even checked my composition on the tripod to make sure I had the shot lined up exactly the right way for that particular location. And they were absolutely wonderful. And I that was unfortunately that was very near the end of my time in Japan. I met them in February 2007 and came home in July of 2007, so I didn't get to hang out with them again. But it was sure a lot of fun, and they couldn't have been more welcoming to the bumbling foreigner out there in the mountains.
Do you think your photography improved while you were there?
Yes, I do. Japan was a place. I mean, it was a place where I really tried to just look at more at everything around me. I mean, not just the trains, but the entire landscape. And being in Mudaran, which was itself kind of a post-industrial town that was very much like the Cleveland, Ohio that I had left in the United States. Steel mills that were clearly still operating, but at far lower production than they had been. Abandoned housing, abandoned industrial complexes, abandoned freight yards. There were a lot of similar stories, and that surprised me. I mean, it shouldn't have surprised me that Japan would have had industrial places, and that some of these would have been past their prime. But I just, these aren't the stereotypical images you get of, the glittering skyscrapers and modern Japan of Tokyo or the traditional temples of Kyoto. It was a different Japan. But for me, it was utterly fascinating, and it really, all of it begged to be photographed. And so I really tried to expand my reach beyond railroads to take in everything around me and kind of react to that with the camera, which is, I think, what we try to do as photographers. And I had some great discussions with some people who have since become dear friends on the Center's board. Jeff Browse and I traded emails regularly, and Jeff really encouraged me to look more at the industrial ruins and some of the other things that I was seeing there. And so it was definitely a time when I started to expand my thinking about photography. And hopefully that came out in better photographs too. But certainly I came to think a lot more creatively and critically about photography there, which was a really rewarding part of that experience.
Great. I have a bit more of an introspective question for you, and I apologize if I don't pronounce any of these Japanese names or words correctly. But this is a question from Naoki Mafune.
Okay.
And he asks, since you left Hokkaido, more trains and lines have been discontinued, and the JR Hokkaido seems to value railroads in only terms of human movement and passenger rail. What do you think should be done to make people appreciate Hokkaido's railroads as a means of providing a fascination of travel?
That's a great question. And so I was very impressed while I was there at the volume of publications that came out about Japanese railways. One of my favorite things to do was to go to the department stores at the first of every month when all of the new magazines came out. And there was one series that was kind of each one was a guide to a different railway line in Japan, and they covered all of the nation. But there were a couple from Hokkaido that I picked up and brought with me. There were a couple of wonderful softcover books that came out about Hokkaido's railways while I was there of contemporary photographs, and they were really evocative, beautiful, creative photographs. So there's certainly a great spirit in Japan, I think, to capture the interest and the allure of railways. How that translates to saving lines, I think, is a real challenge. I know the main line that goes south of Hakodate to the Seikon Tunnel after the bullet train line opened. That line was actually turned over to a third sector operator. I believe it's called the South Hokkaido Railway now, and it still has freight traffic that's part of the JR freight service, and that's actually quite busy. But the passenger service is all provided now by the South Hokkaido Railway. These are mainly local, 1- and 2-car trains serving high school students and grandmothers on shopping trips and that sort of thing. But I know they've been operating a tourist train there that really kind of takes in the coastal running. And I don't know what the economics of that are, but I did see an NHK program on that recently that seemed like that was successful. So I mean, I think if there's opportunities to showcase the beauty of Hokkaido and some of the contrast too. I mean, I think the steel mills of Mudaran were endlessly fascinating for me. And when I was there, they really weren't promoted very much as a part of the things to see for tourists. I have noticed looking at the Mudaran website more recently that there is some industrial tourism happening now. And I think, the embracing the totality of the landscape and maybe not just the quote, scenic wonders, but taking in everything as it's there. Um, I think that's of great interest to people. And if there's more ways to do that through the railways, hopefully the interest will follow that some of these lines can be saved. But I know it's challenging. I mean, you'd ride a lot of these local trains, and the experience was wonderful. But you're on this heavy rail car burning diesel fuel, and there's 3 or 4 other passengers on board, and the economics of that can't be great. So, and car ownership is on the rise. More people are moving out of the rural countries and into the bigger cities. Many of the same challenges we face in the U.S., but just on a different circumstance there. So. I certainly wish everyone success in working on that, and I wish I had a silver bullet, but I don't.
I think that was really well said, and it's clearly not a individual problem. I mean, it's seen all over the world, and it seems to me that Hokkaido is doing better than most other places in terms of preserving that fascination and that attachment to not just railroading but travel in general.
I mean, it sort of has this, to me at least, the Japanese consciousness for Hokkaido is very similar to the American consciousness for Alaska. It's kind of this remote wilderness frontier that people in office buildings in the big cities daydream about visiting someday. And so I think there's really a great fascination in Hokkaido, and hopefully the bullet train will make it more accessible to more of the island, and that can lead to a resurgence in tourism.
Right, so I think we just have 2 more questions, and I think they're a bit more straightforward.
I hope so. That's some great questions. I appreciate that. You're making me think a lot.
So Lyman Holmes asks, were the steam locomotives all home built, or were any of them imported?
Everything that Victor would have photographed was built in Japan. Japan imported its early locomotives from, I think, primarily from Great Britain, from Germany, and from the United States. But by the early 20th century, I think they were building almost entirely all of their own locomotives, and all of the engines we saw would have been built in Japan.
And then Linda Kepik says she noticed that there was some sort of device on the steam locomotive that led pony trucks. Were these sanding devices or some sort of electronic device?
That is a good question, and one I am not able to answer offhand. That's one that will require a little bit more research, unless one of our Japanese friends listening in tonight has a more direct answer.
All right. Well, I think we've gone through all the questions, either directly or indirectly through some of your wonderful narrative and great extent.
You're going to make me end with one that I can't answer?
Sorry. I think this is a place that clearly you can tell that you love and you revere, and it comes across in your passion for it and the research and time that you put in to put this presentation together. And it's been great listening to it.
Oh, thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight. If you think of other questions later, please reach out, and if I can't answer them right away, I'll try to find them. And great thanks, of course, to Victor for his Victor Hand, I should add his last name, for his confidence in the center and allowing us to take on his collection and preserve it and be able to share it. And it's really a privilege to be able to do that, and a lot of fun to go through these photographs of a place that I got to know and love so much.
Yeah, and you can find out more about Victor's collection on our website. We have some highlights of his collection, including an album of the Japanese railways. That's all on railphoto-art.org. Thanks under the collections tab, and then you should be able to find Victor Hand's name.
Yep, that should be right there. And we plan to add more as time and resources allow. All right. Well, join us February 23rd for the Christopher Transportation Museum's Dining Car China collection. That should be another great one, and we'll be working on further offerings for March and April and beyond.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and we are just starting our plannings for our next spring conference, which will also be a virtual conference. we're planning for that to be in April. Date to be announced, but we're narrowing in on an exact date. It'll be on a Saturday for sure, but it's going to be another good one.
And fingers crossed, we might get to be able to get together in person in September, but that all remains to be seen.
I think that's going to be a big fingers crossed.
Well, we'll look forward to another virtual gathering in April and take it from there.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks again, everybody.
Yeah.
Konbanwa. Good night.
Yep.
Goodbye.
Stay safe.
All right. Thanks, everyone.